What if everything you were taught about learning, understanding, and solving problems was built on a system that was never actually designed to help you think? That question sounds uncomfortable because it challenges something most people never question in their entire lives. But decades ago, one physicist quietly decided to test it in the most direct way possible. His name was Richard Feynman. And what he discovered didn't just raise questions about education, it exposed a flaw hidden inside the entire system of knowledge itself. In 1964, in Pasadena, California, Feynman found himself sitting alone in his study, surrounded by an overwhelming sight. 17 feet of shelving filled the room, holding nearly 300 pounds of textbooks. These were not random books. They were every mathematics textbook being considered for public schools in California at the time. Every single one passed through his hands. He wasn't just another member of the review committee. He was, in fact, the only person who actually read them. While others on the commission relied on summaries, reports, and second-hand evaluations from teachers, Feynman did something completely different. He had all the books shipped directly to his home. He built special shelves just to organize them. And then he started reading every page, every chapter, every problem, one by one. What he uncovered wasn't just negligence. It was something far more disturbing. The entire system was built on paperwork, not understanding. Books weren't being evaluated by reading them. They were being evaluated by reviewing opinions about them. Numbers were averaged. Reports were compared. Decisions were made without anyone truly engaging with the actual material. And then came the moment that revealed just how fragile the system really was. One of the publishers missed their submission deadline. Instead of completing the textbook, they submitted something incomplete, an empty book with a proper cover, but no content inside. It was sent along with all the other textbooks into the official review process. And then something unbelievable happened. That blank book received ratings. Not just ratings, but respectable ones. In fact, it scored slightly higher than some fully completed textbooks from the same publisher. Think about that. A book with nothing inside was evaluated as if it contained real educational value. Not because anyone read it, but because no one actually checked. Feynman later described the moment with disbelief, almost frustration. The people responsible for deciding what millions of children would learn were unable to distinguish between an actual textbook and an empty shell. The system wasn't just flawed, it was blind. But that wasn't the most important discovery. Because what Feynman found inside the books that were actually filled with content was even more concerning. In one science textbook designed for young students, there were simple illustrations: a toy car, a real dog, and a motorcycle. Beneath them was a question asking what makes them move. The official answer given in the teacher's edition was simple: energy. And that's where Feynman stopped, because that answer explained nothing. Saying energy makes things move is not an explanation. It's a label disguised as understanding. It's like saying something happens because it happens. It replaces curiosity with vocabulary, and for a child trying to understand the world, it creates the illusion of knowledge without the reality of it. Feynman argued that if you cannot explain how something works without using abstract placeholder words like energy, then you don't actually understand it. Instead, he proposed something radically different. Take the toy apart, show the gears, show the springs, show the actual physical mechanisms that create movement. Let the learner see what is really happening instead of memorizing what it is called. Because real understanding is not about naming things, it is about seeing how they function. But this idea creates tension inside any structured system. Because once people truly understand something, they stop simply accepting it. They start questioning it. And questioning is something most systems are not designed to handle easily. And that's where this story begins to expand beyond textbooks, beyond California, and into something much bigger than education itself. And this is where the story stops being just about textbooks in California and starts becoming something much bigger. Because once Feynman saw how broken the evaluation system was, he realized the problem wasn't limited to one committee, one state, or even one country. It was something deeper, something embedded in how people were being taught to think from the very beginning. To understand how far this goes back, we have to step away from California and go to 1951, when Feynman was teaching in Brazil. At first, everything seemed normal. Students could solve problems, answer questions, and repeat formulas with impressive accuracy. On paper, they looked successful. But something strange happened whenever the questions changed even slightly. If Feynman rephrased the problem or asked it in a different way, the students would freeze. Silence. Not because the problem was harder, but because it wasn't identical to what they had memorized. They weren't thinking, they were recalling. And that difference changed everything. Feynman quickly realized that these students had been trained in a system where success meant repetition, not understanding. They could reproduce answers, but they couldn't adapt them. They had learned procedures, not principles. So he tried something different. Instead of asking them to calculate immediately, he told them to estimate first, to guess, to think before using formulas, to compare results, to question whether their answers made sense. At first, it confused them. It felt wrong, almost like breaking the rules of learning itself, because they had never been asked to think that way before. By the end of the year, Feynman made a harsh observation that would later define much of his educational philosophy. The system, as it existed, was producing students who could pass exams but could not do science. One professor even reacted emotionally, calling his critique extreme, even dangerous. But the results were difficult to ignore. The only students who truly succeeded under Feynman's approach were the ones who had not been fully shaped by the system yet. And that led him to a conclusion that was difficult to accept, but impossible to unsee. The system had a near-perfect failure rate when it came to producing real understanding. Not because people weren't capable, but because they were being trained in imitation instead of reasoning. And this is where Feynman introduced an idea that would later become famous under a strange but powerful name: cargo cult science. He noticed something important. In the South Pacific during World War II, some island communities had observed airplanes landing with supplies. After the war ended, they tried to recreate the conditions that brought the planes. They built fake runways, wooden control towers, and imitation radios. They copied the structure perfectly, but nothing happened, because they were copying the appearance of the system, not the underlying reality that made it work. Feynman used this as a metaphor for science, education, and knowledge itself. People were copying the rituals of understanding, writing equations, using technical language, following procedures, but without grasping the actual principles behind them. They were performing knowledge, not possessing it. And that idea, uncomfortable as it was, began to connect everything he had seen so far. The empty textbook that still received ratings, the students who could repeat but not adapt, the systems that valued appearance over comprehension. It was all the same pattern. And that pattern didn't stop there. It only became more powerful over time. Because today, the same issue exists, but on a much larger scale. We now live in a world where information is unlimited. Every answer is available instantly. Every formula, explanation, and concept can be accessed in seconds. But something strange has happened. Access to information has increased, but understanding has not. And this is where modern systems quietly repeat the same mistake Feynman warned about decades ago. People are trained to recognize patterns, not to understand them. They are taught to follow steps, not to question why those steps exist. They can repeat solutions but struggle when the problem changes even slightly. And now, with the rise of artificial intelligence, this difference becomes even more visible. Because AI systems are incredibly powerful at memorization, prediction, and pattern recognition, they can produce answers instantly. They can summarize, compute, and replicate knowledge at scale. But when faced with something truly new, something outside their learned patterns, they fail in a very specific way. Not because they are slow, but because they do not understand. They recognize structure but not meaning. And in a strange way, that mirrors the exact problem Feynman observed in human systems decades ago. The ability to reproduce knowledge is not the same as the ability to think. And once you see that pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. And once you start seeing that pattern, it stops being something abstract. It starts appearing everywhere in real life, quietly shaping how people work, learn, and even think without them realizing it. Because the same gap Feynman observed in classrooms and committees didn't disappear. It evolved. It became more polished, more efficient, and far less visible. Today, the systems around us are no longer obviously broken like a blank textbook slipping through evaluation. They are far more sophisticated than that. They are optimized, structured, designed to look complete on the surface while hiding the deeper question of whether real understanding is actually happening underneath. We now live inside systems filled with frameworks, certifications, courses, training programs, and perfectly structured learning paths. Everything is organized, everything is validated, everything looks correct. But there is a hidden assumption running through all of it, that following the structure automatically leads to understanding. And that assumption is where the problem begins. Because structure can guide behavior, but it cannot guarantee comprehension. You can complete a course without understanding the subject. You can pass an exam without being able to apply the knowledge. You can memorize every step of a process and still freeze the moment something changes. And yet, these systems still reward completion over comprehension. This is where Feynman's idea of cargo cult science becomes even more relevant today than it was when he first described it. People are not just copying rituals of science anymore. They are copying the rituals of learning, thinking, and even problem solving. They follow templates for success. They repeat methods that are said to work. They trust procedures because they are widely accepted. But very few stop to ask the deeper question. Do I actually understand what I am doing? And this is where a subtle but powerful illusion forms, the illusion of competence. It feels like understanding, because everything is familiar. The steps are known, the language is recognizable, the process has been repeated before. But familiarity is not the same as clarity. And that is exactly where most thinking breaks down. Because real understanding only reveals itself when something unexpected happens, when the problem changes, when the pattern no longer fits, when the memorized path stops working. And in that moment, two types of minds appear. One mind looks for a reference, a similar example, a remembered solution, something external to copy. The other mind stops and rebuilds the problem from scratch. This difference is subtle, but it defines everything that comes after it. Feynman was firmly in the second category. He didn't trust understanding that couldn't survive pressure. He treated knowledge like something fragile unless it could be rebuilt from the ground up. If he couldn't explain an idea simply, he assumed he didn't truly understand it yet. Not because simplicity is easy, but because confusion often hides behind complexity. And this is where another important principle appears, one that quietly separates real thinkers from everyone else. Self-deception is the easiest thing in the world. It doesn't require effort. It happens automatically. You can convince yourself you understand something just because you recognize the words. You can feel confident just because you've seen it before. You can believe you are capable because you have followed instructions successfully in the past. But none of that guarantees real comprehension. Feynman understood this better than most. That's why he constantly tested his own thinking. He didn't just ask, "Do I know this?" He asked something much more uncomfortable. Am I fooling myself right now? Because that question forces honesty, and honesty is where real thinking begins. And as this idea deepens, it becomes clear that the issue is not just with education or systems or even technology. It is something more personal. It is about how easily the human mind replaces understanding with familiarity and thought with repetition without ever noticing the difference. And that realization leads directly into something even more important, how thinking actually works when you strip away everything unnecessary. Once you remove the illusion of understanding, what remains is something far more raw and far more demanding. Thinking itself, without shortcuts, without templates, without borrowed answers. And this is where Feynman's real method begins to matter, not as a theory, but as a way of operating in the world. He didn't treat thinking as something automatic. He treated it as something active, something that had to be rebuilt every time a new problem appeared. And at the center of his approach was something surprisingly simple. He refused to accept anything he couldn't rebuild from scratch. If an idea was real, it should survive being broken down and reconstructed. If it depended too heavily on memorized steps or borrowed explanations, it was not yet understood. So instead of starting with answers, he started with questions. Not surface-level questions, but questions that stripped ideas down to their core. What is actually happening here? Why does this work? What would happen if I remove this assumption? What if everything I believe about this is wrong? These questions were not meant to be answered quickly. They were meant to expose weak understanding. And this is where his thinking process becomes very different from traditional learning. Most people start with knowledge and try to apply it. Feynman started with confusion and tried to eliminate it. One of his key habits was deceptively simple. Whenever he encountered a new idea, he would attempt to explain it in the simplest possible terms, as if teaching it to someone with no background at all. If he couldn't do that, he didn't move forward. Not because the idea was necessarily wrong, but because his understanding of it was incomplete. This approach creates discomfort because it removes the safety net of vague language. You cannot hide behind technical terms. You cannot rely on memorized phrases. You cannot pretend to understand by repeating what others have said. You either understand it clearly or you don't understand it yet. And that honesty changes everything. Because once you remove the ability to hide confusion, you are forced to confront it directly. And that is where real learning begins. Feynman also relied heavily on what can be described as mental stress testing. He didn't just learn ideas passively. He attacked them mentally. He tried to break them. He looked for contradictions. He changed conditions. He asked how fragile the idea really was. If it collapsed under slight variation, it was not solid knowledge. It was imitation. This is where most systems fail people without them realizing it. They reward stability. They reward correct repetition. They reward predictable answers. But real understanding is not stable in the beginning. It is unstable, messy, and constantly evolving. And that is why most people avoid it without knowing they are avoiding it. Because instability feels like failure, even when it is actually progress. Feynman reversed that completely. For him, instability was a signal that he was close to something real. Confusion was not a warning sign. It was a direction. And over time, this creates a very different relationship with problems. Instead of asking, how do I solve this quickly? The question becomes, what is this really made of? Instead of looking for the answer, you start looking for structure. And that shift changes how you see everything from science and education to work, decisions, and even everyday thinking. But there is still one more layer to this story, and it is the one that connects everything back to your own life in a way that cannot be ignored. Because at this point, this is no longer just about Feynman, education systems, or even science itself. It becomes something much closer to home. It becomes about how you think when you are alone with a problem that does not fit any familiar pattern. The uncomfortable truth is that most people rarely reach that point, not because they are incapable, but because the systems around them constantly prevent it. There is always a shortcut available, always a template, always a solution that has already been packaged, tested, and approved. So the mind learns a quiet habit. Don't think too deeply, just find what already works. Over time, this becomes automatic. When a problem appears, the first instinct is not to understand it, but to categorize it, to match it with something familiar, to reduce it into something that already has an answer. And that is where thinking stops. Feynman rejected this completely. He believed that the moment you stop asking what is actually happening and start relying on what is already known, you lose contact with reality. Because reality does not care about your memorized systems. It does not adjust itself to your expectations. It does not follow your notes, your formulas, or your past experience. It simply is. And if your thinking is built only on repetition, it breaks the moment reality changes even slightly. This is why Feynman placed so much importance on starting from zero. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a disciplined one. He would strip away assumptions, remove inherited explanations, and rebuild understanding step by step from direct observation. Not what he was told, not what was expected, but what could actually be seen, tested, and reasoned. And this is where the real separation appears between memorization and understanding. Memorization depends on stability. It works only when conditions stay the same. Understanding, however, survives change. It adapts. It rebuilds itself when needed. That is why someone who truly understands something can explain it in different ways, apply it in new contexts, and still remain accurate. While someone who only memorized it becomes silent the moment the format changes. This difference shows up everywhere once you start looking for it. In workplaces, where people can follow procedures perfectly but struggle when something unexpected happens. In education, where students can pass exams but cannot apply knowledge outside the test. In everyday thinking, where confidence often replaces clarity. And now, with systems becoming more automated and intelligence tools becoming more powerful, this gap is becoming even more visible. Because when machines can already provide answers instantly, the value of simply knowing things decreases. What becomes valuable instead is the ability to judge, interpret, and rebuild understanding when information is incomplete or unclear. In other words, the ability to think, not repeat, not recall, not imitate, but think. Feynman's warning was never just about education. It was about a deeper tendency in human nature, the tendency to confuse familiarity with understanding and structure with truth. And once you see that clearly, something important changes. You stop trusting the feeling of, I know this, just because it looks familiar. You start questioning whether you can actually rebuild it without help. You start testing your own understanding instead of assuming it. And that shift is subtle but powerful, because it changes your relationship with uncertainty. Instead of avoiding confusion, you begin to use it as a signal. Instead of rushing to find answers, you begin to slow down and examine the problem itself. Instead of relying on what is already known, you start asking what is actually true. And over time, that builds something most systems never teach directly: independence of thought. Not the ability to know more, but the ability to think without needing permission, structure, or pre-made answers. That is what Feynman demonstrated, not through lectures or theories, but through the way he approached every problem he touched. He didn't trust knowledge that couldn't survive questioning. He didn't accept explanations that couldn't be simplified. And he didn't allow himself to believe he understood something unless he could rebuild it from the ground up. That mindset is uncomfortable because it removes certainty. It replaces it with responsibility. But it is also the only approach that survives a world where information is everywhere and real understanding is rare. So the final question is not whether the system is broken or fixed. The real question is whether you are thinking or just repeating what you were given. Because in the end, the system can provide answers, but only you can decide whether you actually understand them. And if you take one idea from all of this, let it be this. The moment you start thinking from zero, you stop depending on the system and start building your own understanding of reality. If this message made you reflect differently, consider subscribing, because what we explore here goes far beyond surface level knowledge. It goes into how real thinking actually works in a world full of ready-made answers.